Hello and welcome to China Forum, the leading program for discussing the latest in trends and development in modern Chinese culture, politics, economics, and social issues. My name is Shannon Chiesi, and I'll be your moderator for our program today. Today on China Forum, we'll be discussing cybersecurity issues in the U.S. China relationship. We're joined today by a leading expert on cybersecurity, Dr. James Lewis. Dr. Lewis is a senior fellow and director of the Technology and Public Policy program at CSIS, in addition to teaching at Johns Hopkins University. He previously worked at the Departments of State and Commerce as a Foreign Service Officer and as a member of the Senior Executive Service. Dr. Lewis also serves as the U.S. lead for a long-running Track 2 dialogue on cybersecurity with the China Institutes of Contemporary International Relations. Dr. Lewis is the author of the best-selling report on cybersecurity for the 44th presidency. Dr. Lewis, thank you for joining us today.
Glad to be here.
While experts have been concerned about cybersecurity for years, the recent focus on cybersecurity as an issue in U.S. China relations comes in the wake of several high-profile announcements about hacking and cyber intrusions allegedly originating in China. Most notably, the Mandiant Intelligence Center issued a report documenting economic espionage done by a Chinese military unit. As an expert in the field of cybersecurity, can you explain for us a little bit about the Mandiant report, what their findings were, and from your opinion, how credible and how thorough the report was?
Mandiant was sort of the public face of something that has been going on for a long time. And so it brought to the public's attention a problem that the U.S. had been engaged at the presidential level and the cabinet level for almost 2 years, right? So the public release is interesting. It's kind of a funny story. So Mandiant is about the Chinese hacking the New York Times. And it turns out they've hacked a lot of newspapers. In the case of the Times, it looks like the inspiration was a series of articles on Wen Jiabao's family's wealth. And the Chinese wanted to know who leaked, who was talking, who was the one that gave the Times reporters this information. In a way, it's kind of a backhand confirmation of the accuracy of the story. So there's usually a political motive when they go after things like this. They're looking for Tibetan human rights activists, they're looking for business information, they're looking for this kind of political stuff. They have different motives when they go after U.S. companies or the Department of Defense. There should be no doubt in anyone's mind that China is behind these activities.
But the Chinese, at least public response, has been to categorically deny any involvement, any government sponsorship of this hacking. What are we to make of these denials?
Well, you know, no great power bursts into tears and says, I confess you caught me, when you catch them spying. And in particular, China, the normal Chinese line to any sort of accusation like this is, it wasn't us, and in any case, you do it too, right? So they are just playing the role we would expect. It's not, it's just that's what people say in public. You know, we say we neither confirm nor deny. They say it wasn't us. Who cares? It doesn't really make any difference what their public statements are.
So are we seeing a different response from them in private discussions on the topic?
The thing that caught their attention was the call from President Obama to President Xi, the new President Xi, where he basically said, this has to stop. The Donnellan speech in February at the Asia Society in New York, that laid out 3 conditions the Chinese have to meet on cybersecurity. That really got their attention. So you do see some re-examination in China of what their current policies are.
And in addition to those talks, Secretary of State John Kerry was recently in Beijing. So was General Dempsey, chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And they both raised cybersecurity issues. Are we seeing any progress being made based on the Obama administration's intense focus on this issue?
One of the things to bear in mind is this isn't the first time we've had discussions like this with the Chinese. And it will take years for them to change because it's difficult to get that kind of change that we want in China. It's going to be politically difficult for Xi, but the Dempsey talks, the Kerry talks both saw the Chinese agree to make this a substantial dialogue on the real problem. So that shows they're, finally beginning to take it a little more seriously.
Now, when we talk about cybersecurity issues, there's actually a whole lot of problems, and you mentioned some of them. We have hacking into news outlets like the New York Times, also corporate spying, corporate espionage done through computer intrusions. And then we also have the potential for attacks on critical infrastructure. So when we talk about cybersecurity as an issue in U.S. China relations, which of these should we be the most concerned about?
Espionage is the biggest problem, and particularly economic espionage, right? Sure, the Chinese have the ability to use cyber weapons to launch attacks on critical infrastructure, other targets. So do we. It's like missiles, it's like rockets. They're not going to just wake up one day in a bad mood and shoot a rocket at us. So this is another weapon in the arsenal. Should we get into a conflict, you should expect to see cyber attacks. Maybe not on the American homeland, but certainly on U.S. forces in the region. That's just a normal military thing. It's not a big deal, right? There are other people you might want to be more worried about when it comes to attacking critical infrastructure, but China in this sense is going to be a responsible partner and act the way we'd expect them to act in any military discussion. Espionage is a different matter, and this has been going on for decades. When Deng Xiaoping decided to open the Chinese economy to the West, one of the policies they implemented was the illicit acquisition of Western technology to accelerate their own development so they could catch up with and surpass Western countries. And so they have been doing this for decades. And what you saw at the end of the 1990s with the introduction of the internet into China was they moved their traditional illicit acquisition of technology into cyberspace. So for about a decade, it's been a huge problem. The Chinese could say, with reason, we spy on them. That's quite true. But we don't do economic espionage. We don't spy on Chinese companies. We don't steal information to give benefit to our specific companies. And that's what they do. And it's really not sort of how you play the game. That's where things are a problem. Tremendous losses on the military side for the U.S., losses on the business side as well. Harder to scope. How much is intellectual property worth? Hard to say. But we know that they've gone way past the line, and the effort you see now is trying to get them to roll back a little bit, to behave like any other country.
So given that this is such a long-standing problem, what tactics is the Obama administration using to try to engage on this issue, to try to make progress on this issue?
Well, it's a traditional diplomatic strategy, and in some ways it's kind of the best we can do. You have to have high-level visits, you have to have continued attention, you have to have everyone who goes to China at a senior level raise this issue, right? You have to ask for dialogue, you have to ask for ongoing talks. They've done all that, and in the last year we tried quiet diplomacy, and the Chinese answer was, that's really interesting, we'll get back to you. This year, maybe not so quiet diplomacy, and we're seeing a little movement. The hard part will be this is a politically difficult problem for the Chinese. It's something that's tied to money, and so Beijing will be, in effect, asking people, we'd like you to stop making money at the expense of the Americans. Politically very difficult. So we're going to have to look for ways to ratchet up the pressure, and whether that's trade measures or indictments or no-fly lists, you should look for that in the next year.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned earlier that China has also accused the U.S. of cyber intrusions. Mm-hmm. What role does that play in these negotiations?
Next to none. It's not really comparable at all in scope. One of the problems is, and the Chinese take technology because they're really worried that they can't innovate on their own. And they're probably right. I mean, this is some reflection of the internal politics in China. If you have a monolithic party, it's hard to be innovative, right? Mm-hmm. When you take Chinese out of China, they can be really innovative, but inside China, something happens. And so the answer is, well, if we can't innovate, we'll borrow, right? We don't have that problem, right? What Chinese company would you want to steal technology from? What Chinese military program is ahead of the U.S. military program? So that shapes the espionage in ways that make it uneven, uncomfortable. Sure, everyone does political espionage, everyone does military espionage, but this economic espionage is where the core of the problem is.
Mm-hmm. So most of the engagements we're seeing now are over the issue of economic espionage, is that correct?
It's hard to say what the agenda will look like because there's political, military issues, confidence building measures, norms, reducing the chance of miscalculation and misperception. Those are traditional. Those we're making good progress on, I think. On the economic issue, you know, the Chinese have to step back and say, how do they get control of this thing? What are they even doing? How much do they want to give up? Knowing that there's economic and political risks for them if they stop economic espionage.
Mm-hmm. We've been talking about these cyber issues mostly as a bilateral issue, but obviously it's a global one.
Right.
So how does the bilateral U.S. China discussion on this issue fit into global patterns of economic espionage? What other players are there in this game?
One of the things that really shaped opinion, and this is where the Mandiant report, you know, that's what's publicly available on the inside, on a classified level. A review of the people engaged in economic espionage showed that China was by far the leading perpetrator, many times more than any other country, many times more than its nearest competitor, Russia, right? So the Russians spy on us too, that's not a surprise, but they're dwarfed by what China does. So China's come out in the lead here. We're not the only country. Australia, Japan, India, Brazil, Canada, Germany. There's a long list of countries that have had this problem. You know, if you're the prime minister and you wake up and you find the Chinese are on your email, you might be unhappy, but that's happened in 4 countries, right? So there's a global sense that this is an unstable environment and we need to find some way to make it stable. That means working with the Chinese and the Russians, but there is a big set of negotiations, multiple negotiations to try and come up with rules, to try and come up with understandings, to try and make cyberspace a more stable environment.
Now, since this issue has really come into the public consciousness, you've seen some people throwing around terms like cyber warfare or a cyber cold war, and you don't like this term cyber war, especially as applied to U.S. China currently. So what would you classify as a cyber war between the U.S. and China? What would have to happen?
One of the things I like about this field is you can just make stuff up. So there's just immense quantities of bad ideas out there. And cyber Cold War, what the heck is cyber Cold War? You know, it's like it's not a bipolar relationship. You know, our 2 economies are intertwined. That's not how it was with the Soviet Union. Cold War doesn't make any sense. Cyber war. People love this one and they say cyber attack, but one of the things you're seeing happen internationally is a recognition that we can use existing international law, the UN Charter, the Hague Convention, the Geneva Convention, and we can take those and apply them to cyber conflict. And that means that an attack has to involve the use of force, right? And the use of force has to cause death or destruction or casualties, physical destruction, right? There's some places where there's a little ambiguity. We'll work them out through experience, which we're bound to get. But that's a war, right? That's the use of force. And if you don't see that, and of course espionage doesn't involve any of that, it's not the use of force, it's not war. It's important to note that war is a political decision. So a foreign power can blow up a U.S. Air Force housing facility in the Middle East, and we'll decide not to go to war with them. That's a political decision. It was the use of force. It was a foreign state. We decided not to go to war. Similarly, the Iranians, Stuxnet was the use of force. It caused physical destruction, but they didn't go to war. War is a political decision. Use of force is a legal decision, and nothing that China has done to the U.S. qualifies as the use of force.
There have been some attempts, as you mentioned, to take existing conventions and apply them to cyber war. And one that recently came out was called the Talon Manual, where a group of experts tied to NATO came up with what they thought was a useful framework.
NATO will be quick to deny that they're linked to the Talon Manual. And I got a long lecture from NATO's assistant secretary about it wasn't them, They were tired of explaining that. They didn't endorse it. Came from out of left field.
Okay.
So the Talon manual, nice try, right? And about 80% of it is good. One of the problems was we have the Geneva Conventions on the laws of war, and a Swiss jurist named Pictet wrote some really valuable commentaries as part of a committee, right? Mm-hmm. And so the Talon manual wanted to be the Pictets of cyberspace, right? And they wanted to write the commentaries that would explain how the laws of war apply. The problem is we don't have an agreement, right? We don't have a common understanding. Now, frankly, we don't have that much experience. The Hague Convention, the Geneva Conventions were written by people who had been in wars and knew they would fight wars again. That was not the case with the Talon manual. So that means you got some very funny things, and I've kidded them about it in that it shows a certain degree of inastuteness if the headline you get out of your report is NATO endorses drone strikes against hackers. NATO does not endorse drone strikes against hackers. But you could read the Talon manual, or they would say misread it to come to that conclusion. So maybe a nice first try, but not a home run. And now what we have to do is sit down and see, can we get that international agreement? You've got negotiations in the UN. You've got separate negotiations that started in London. You have the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe. You have the ASEAN Regional Forum. A lot of people are looking at this. And so maybe a year from now, it'll be time to write a Talon manual that's a little more on target.
It seems like one of the problems with coming to an international agreement is that different countries have very different views on how the internet should work, how it should be policed, how it should be censored in the case of some countries. There are different ideas on the freedom of information, in other words. How does this factor into trying to get a global discussion going on cyber norms?
This is the key problem in some ways, and it's really an issue of freedom of speech, right, and freedom of access to information. If you are afraid of your citizens having free access to information, you're not going to like the internet. And that's what's driving the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians. They don't want their citizens reading about Wen Jiabao's family in the newspaper, right? And so they've said, gosh, we need to restructure this thing and give governments a greater role and make the technology more, global. And what they're really saying is they want to get control of information. The Russians and the Chinese used to say that information is a weapon, right? And therefore it should be treated under the laws of armed conflict. That's completely insane. In talking to some of them, I've said, I understand if I dropped the Sunday New York Times from a high building and it landed on someone, it would maybe qualify as the use of force. But short of that, this is nutty. And so they've backed away from that, but they're still trying to fundamentally re-architect the internet to make information easier for governments to control. And that's what's driving a lot of the debate. I don't think they're going to get very far with that, and it's going to be an awkward couple of years while we fight this out.
Right. So do you think there is hope for eventually coming to a consensus on these issues? We're
very close to consensus on the rule of sovereignty. Their national sovereignty applies in cyberspace. That means there are borders. There are borders. It's all physical. It's based on cables. And if there are borders, countries can enforce them, right? Countries can figure out, I need a new technology, like maybe I need airplanes for airspace, and I'll need new technologies to enforce my borders in cyberspace. That's the path we're on. And it's a good development, because if sovereignty applies, states have all the responsibilities they have everywhere else. The responsibility towards neutral states, the responsibilities to respect trade agreements, the responsibilities to avoid the use of force. So we're on the path to consensus on sovereignty and the application of existing international law. There will be hard areas, and freedom of access to information is the biggest one. There's a long debate, much broader than cybersecurity, over which has precedence, national sovereignty or universal rights. Difficult to work out. It's going to be a political decision. But as we make progress in answering that question, we will be able to come to a more stable environment in cyberspace.
We've been talking about state actors so far, but obviously when it comes to cyberspace, there are a lot of non-state actors, individual hackers, people loosely organized into groups like Anonymous. And you can't expect these people to accede to international norms, even if we were to come to an agreement. So,
but I can expect to arrest them.
So can you explain a little bit about the responsibility, say, America or China would have if these groups are operating on their sovereign soil?
Oh, okay. We'll put that in physical space to think about it. Suppose there was a pirate base in Hainan Island, right? And it sailed out, was very obvious, and sailed out and attacked merchant ships. Nobody would let the Chinese say, gosh, we have no idea who it is, we're sorry, they're private actors, we can't get control of them. We would expect them to go and enforce the law, right? And that's the expectation for cyberspace. These groups make a lot of noise. They aren't that good. Maybe they'll get better, and that's one reason why we need international agreement that when a non-state actor violates the law, that they will be arrested. And that will happen to you now. If you live in the US, if you live in Western Europe, maybe you can get away with it a few times, but you're not going to get away with it very often. If you live in Russia or you live in China and you're doing something that the state wants you to do, you'll get away with it forever. That's what we got to change. So non-state actors, not the biggest problem, you know, and the answer to them is law enforcement cooperation, agreement to enforce the law. That's what we need from China and Russia.
And one of the things we've heard, especially from China, is that it's very difficult technically to trace the origin of these attacks. How would you respond to that?
Did I hear violins playing in the background? That's really a touching story. It's so hard to tell. It's not hard to tell, and it's getting easier, right? So most people know that it's possible to remotely turn on the web camera on your computer or on your mobile device. And that means that if I wanted to, in some instances, I could watch Chinese hackers as they were doing their stuff. This is not a hypothetical story, right? I've told the Chinese, you really got to get your hackers to dress better. I'm tired of seeing these guys in their undershirts. Attribution is a problem that's in decline. It's getting easier and easier to identify people. The US has the lead in some ways because we can do what people will call all-source intelligence. So if I'm monitoring your computer networks and I'm monitoring your cell phone calls and I have a drone overhead and maybe I have human agents and I put all that together and I can tell who you are. 5 years ago, DoD told me they could determine who was responsible in 1 out of 3 attacks. More recently, they've told me that that rate has more than doubled. So it's an end of an era here in terms of anonymity. We know who's doing this. The Chinese know who's doing it. Yeah, sure, there's cases where you can't tell, but those are the minority.
So when it comes to trying to deal with these issues diplomatically, what do you think will happen first? Will we see U.S. and China come to an agreement? Will we see an international framework being meshed out?
That's a good question. You've got multiple tracks going on at the same time. You have a UN track, you have this London track, you have regional tracks, and you have the bilateral track. And right now, it's hard to say which one will pull ahead. If I was going to bet, there's a fair chance that you'll see something come out of this London process, London Conference on Cybersecurity, whose next meeting is in early October in Korea, in Seoul. And that one, maybe you'll get some commitments on responsible state behavior. There's a chance that you might get something good out of the UN in the summer. Much longer for the Chinese and the US to reach agreement, but we don't want to be too optimistic. You know, all of these things are hard. We are close to agreement, but it could take another year multilaterally among like-minded countries to reach agreement. And among the countries that aren't like-minded, it will take much longer.
So as these countries try to work this out, is this kind of taking place, as you mentioned earlier, below the level of public consciousness, or is it starting to spill out and affect the broader relationship, especially between the U.S. and China?
The part where I've seen an effect is that a year or two ago, if you said, I want to do something mean to the Chinese, American companies would say, don't do that, it will affect my business interests there. And a lot of them aren't saying that now. That might be a sign of how bad the problem has become. So I do see a shift in public attitude, and I think as people become more aware of the scope of the problem, it will be politically intolerable. And it's good that the president has moved out on this. He's the first president to have raised this with the Chinese. That's great. But we're going to have to keep shoving, and it's going to be hard. And I think it will be something that could seriously damage the bilateral relationship if we don't get it under control. And to get it under control, we're going to need a little cooperation from the other side.
And another way that this has played out has been much concern in the U.S. over certain Chinese technological companies. The most famous examples being Huawei and ZTE in telecommunications, that they pose a national security threat because of possible security issues. How big of a problem do you think that is, as opposed to the problem of cyber espionage taking place in China, but the problem that maybe Chinese technology being imported into the U.S. is contributing?
You know, the main problem is hackers in China, right? And somewhere down the road, should the U.S. ever figure out how to make its defenses better, which is a political problem here, we just can't get Congress to agree on anything, then the Chinese will need some new techniques to break in, right? And that's where being embedded in the telecom system would be useful. So there's a future risk. The problem with Huawei is Huawei's just not that good at public relations. The problem is one of trust. And so where we want to end up is a place where we can trust Huawei enough to buy their stuff. Their stuff's good. We should be able to buy it. But no one trusts them. And no one trusts them because they're always doing the wrong thing. You know, they put the real bio of their chairwoman on the web, and then people say, hey, look at her real bio, and they take it off. They come in and they say, we'll let you inspect our source code, and you say, oh, that doesn't really do any good. And they, we forgot to mention that, right? So they just routinely, they go to buy an American company in California, a little American company. No one really cares, but they forget to come in and apply to the CSIS committee, right? Forget? You don't do stuff like that over and over again and then come and say, trust us, buy our stuff. So Huawei's problem is the trust deficit that their own actions have largely created, and that's what they need to work on.
Well, I'm afraid we're out of time for today, but thank you so much for an insightful discussion into these issues. Experts like you have known about it for a long time, but it's new to me and to our viewers, so thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you to our viewers for joining us. We will see you next time on China Forum.